Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our second Wheelhouse Talk of the year. My name is Grace Tummel, and I serve as the program manager for the Cook Leadership Academy here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. With each new day in this role, I am filled with more gratitude to be a part of this community and to be working within the legacies of Ralph Hauenstein and Peter Cook. While I was never able to meet Peter or Ralph, I learned more about their character and accomplishments with each new day. Just this week, I learned about the items within the swag bags that we give to all of our speakers and distinguished guests. While we work very hard up in our office, we also do our best to do a great job honoring the lighter sides of Ralph and Peter. We tend to have fun, so including Ralph's favorite snacks didn't seem that out of the ordinary to me. I feel like it is my duty to let you all know that not only did he enjoy a savory and sweet snack, he also invented both of those items. Goldfish crackers and Andy's mints, that is. So you all can now join us in never feeling guilty and indulging in those snacks. While being a part of Ralph and Peter's legacies is an immense pleasure, working with the students within the Cook Leadership Academy is an honor that I cannot begin to describe. We have students across disciplines, backgrounds, and academic standings. Each of our fellow candidates has their own story to tell, strengths to apply, and ambitions to achieve. Through every part of CLA, I find such joy watching our students interact, hone their abilities, and take steps to achieve incredible feats. Our Wheelhouse Talk speaker series provides us with the opportunity to hear personal stories and leadership lessons from some of our community's most distinguished leaders. All of us, especially our students, can take bits and pieces from each of these unique experiences that our speakers provide and apply them to our personal leadership philosophies. Today, we have the honor to be joined by a man who has spent his life focusing on equity and inclusion. Juan Olivarez comes to us today with a wealth of knowledge and leadership experience across several disciplines. I now invite one of our outstanding Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidates, Kaylor Sweeney, to introduce the man that we all came here to learn from.
Thank you, Grace, community members, and my fellow Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidates. I've been asked to introduce our speaker today, but before I do that, I want to tell a short story. A year ago, I interviewed for a graduate assistant position at Grand Valley's Johnson Center for Philanthropy. I interviewed with 2 professors at the center to whom I would report if I received the position. The interview went well, and I was contacted for the job. I had asked plenty of questions in my interview about the research agendas of the 2 professors, and I looked forward to working with them. However, when I showed up to complete the necessary paperwork, I was told that another student had been chosen for that position. They believed my talents would be better suited working with someone named Juan. Sometimes life goes full circle. A year ago, I left the Johnson Center that day typing, "Who is Juan Olivarez?" into Google. Needless to say, I was not disappointed. A year of working as Juan's graduate assistant later, I stand here honored to answer that same question for you all. So who is Juan? Juan R. Olivarez, PhD, was named a Distinguished Scholar in residence for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy in 2018. Throughout his career, Olivarez has been a passionate champion for equity and inclusion. He was the first Hispanic president of any college or university in the state of Michigan, serving as the 8th president of Grand Rapids Community College from 1999 to 2008. He later became president of Aquinas College, his alma mater, from 2011 to 2017. Between these 2 presidencies, he served as president and CEO of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation from 2008 to 2011. Olivarez has served on many national, regional, and local boards, including the National Institute for Literacy, appointed by President George W. Bush, Council for Independent Colleges, Educational Testing Services, the National Commission on Adult Education, Early Childhood Investment Corporation, Van Andel Education Institute, and Spectrum Health System. Olivarez has served on many national, regional, and local boards as well, including the Van Andel Education Institute, Spectrum Health, Mercy Health St. Mary's, and First Steps Kent. Dr. Olivarez has served on several foundation boards, including the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, Grand Rapids Community College Foundation, the Aquinas College Foundation, Public Education Fund, and has served as an advisor to several family foundations. He has been the recipient of many distinguished awards, including the Edward J. Fry Distinguished Achievement Award from Junior Achievement, the Community Trustee Award from the Chamber of Commerce, Champion of Literacy Award from the Literacy Center of West Michigan, and Educational Excellence Award from MSU. Finally, Mayor's Champion of Diversity Award from former Mayor of Grand Rapids, George Hartwell. Dr. Olivarez and his wife Mary have 2 adult sons, a daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. Juan, I want to thank you for your dedicated leadership you've given our community, your support given to the Hauenstein Center as mentor and speaker, and for your guidance and friendship this past year. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Juan Olivarez.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Kaler. That was very nice. And I was the lucky one who got Kaler. I needed somebody who knew database and to help me with all the research that I was to do. So he came in and helped establish that, and he's been great. And earlier this week, we both presented at the Council of Michigan Foundations, and Kaler did a great job of helping me present information on inclusive growth in communities. We've been studying them from around the country, and Kaler has become almost an expert in all of this with me, so that's great. Well, it is a privilege to be here, to be asked to be in front of these great students. I know a few of them. Kaler has been one of them, and they have so much to offer currently while they're students, but also I'm sure in the future as they move out. So thank you for having me here. I'm delighted also to be here because it reminds me of Ralph Hauenstein and also Peter Cook, who I had the privilege of knowing and working with and having great conversation with for many years. And I learned a lot from both of them. And I feel privileged to be here at a place that has both of their names. So I really don't know, students, what I can teach you at all today, but certainly my life's journey and my career, I hope will have some nuggets that maybe you can learn from, take away with you, and maybe inspire you in some way. I think everybody has a story, and everybody has an important story, and we can always learn from those and try to fit them in our own lives as we try to do good work. And so today I am going to give you my journey, and hopefully you will take something away from that. I will try to weave in through that journey the learnings that I've had along the way. And also, at the end, I want to leave you with some final thoughts about leadership. Again, hoping that you take away whatever fits you. I know that there's a diverse audience here today, but I really am focusing on the students, obviously. That's why we're here. And so my comments will be directed to them, and hopefully at the end there will be some questions. So let me tell you a little bit about my background, first of all, where I come from and what shaped me in those early years. So I was born in Alice, Texas. Alice, Texas is in South Texas. It's down in the valley. We call it the valley. It's very dry. It's kind of deserty. It's very hot and humid in the summertime. And that's where my parents come from, and that's where my grandparents come from. So we were in that original area of Texas that was considered Mexican Texas, and it was part of Mexico at one time, and then it split, and then it became a part of the United States. And so my ancestry, much of it comes from that area. So when people ask me when we crossed the border, when we came over, or where are you from in Mexico, it's hard for people to unless they know the history, to understand that that's where we're from. We're from Texas. We're considered Tejanos. That's the word that's used for us who are from that area. So my first language was Spanish. We lived in a very small town down there by Alice. We didn't live right in Alice, but right outside of Alice. And I started kindergarten, and that's when we started learning English. We had a mission school run by Mercy Sisters. And if you know Mercy Sisters, they are quite disciplinarians, and they made sure that we were going to be acculturated and that we were going to fit into the mainstream. And so they were very strict about teaching us English and teaching us the ways. And so I learned a lot from them. I didn't like being punished for speaking Spanish, because we were. But that's the way it was, and they meant well, but it kind of made us feel like perhaps it wasn't good to speak another language, to speak Spanish, and so sometimes it was hard to understand that learning that we were getting. But we lived in a community a small community, but it was 100% Mexican Americans. And so obviously we did speak Spanish, except when we were in school. I was brought up by two wonderful parents who I adored. I learned a lot from. They gave me a lot of strength and a lot of know-how. Neither one of them finished school. My mother had a 3rd grade education, my father a 9th grade education. But they were worldly people. In other words, they learned everywhere they could, whatever they could. They were very creative. My father became a carpenter, although that's not what he did for a living. But he was very good as a carpenter, and he built our little house that we had in Texas. And they were able to make life as good for us as they possibly could. They wanted the best for us. They always told us that education was the ticket out of poverty, and that's what they wanted for us. So from when I can remember, it was always school first, and always being in school. We could never be out of school. I had to have a fever and throwing up before I could stay home. And so that was the way we were brought up. And so education was really a big value that they taught us. I have 2 brothers. I'm the middle child. We can talk about that later. I have an older brother who lives in Lansing and soon to move to Grand Rapids. So it's going to be great to be in the same city together and close together. We're very good friends. My younger brother was born with Down syndrome, and so we learned a lot from him. He was a blessing to our family. He brought us a lot of joy and a lot of comfort in many ways, and taught us how to be a family too, and how to take care of each other. I was his legal guardian after my parents couldn't really care for him anymore. And I did convince my mom to put him in a group home, and I was able to navigate that for her. And my father, she did not want to let him go. She was 80 and finally said, "Okay, I'm ready." It took me 10 years to hear those words. But I finally got her there, and we put him into a group home about 40 miles from where they lived, and she got to see that he was happy, and she got to see that other people could care for him just as good as she could care for him, and so that was great. When I was 7, we moved to East Chicago, Indiana, which is by Gary, Indiana. And we knew the North. My father and uncle knew the North pretty well. And we would travel north to do migrant work. And so when they saw that steel mills were hiring a lot of labor, they decided that perhaps they could get a job, and a job that paid well in those days, and a job like that, even if it was in labor, it was more than they could make and we could make in the fields. So they took a risk, and they applied, and they got jobs. And so about 9 months later, they brought the rest of the family up. We only had 3 children. My uncle had 12 children. So, and we all came up in a truck, tarp-covered truck, and there were no expressways to speak about in those days in the late 50s, and so it took about three and a half days to get up here. And it was quite the journey with that many people. And so we arrived in East Chicago. I think it was November, and there was a little bit of snow flying, not accumulating, but these white flakes coming down. We had never seen it before. And it was quite a culture shock also. Talk about diversity. It was quite diverse. The languages, the colors of people, and the cultures that were just all brought together in this very, very tight area. Very tight area. People would fight, and I didn't understand that. I didn't understand how adults could be fighting. I'd never seen that before. And it was because of the situation. We were all tightly in these neighborhoods under the smokestacks of Inland Steel, where my father worked. And it was quite something. We were also put in public school in Texas. That Catholic school I spoke of didn't charge tuition. But up in the north, they did charge tuition, and so my parents couldn't do that, so we were put in public school. And that was an experience also. We had no playground except a pavement playground, and they closed off the streets so that we could kick a ball around, and cars couldn't go through there while we had recess and lunch. And it was quite smelly. In those days, there were no restrictions, as some of you can remember, and it smelled terrible all the time. It smelled like sulfur all the time, and I wasn't used to that either, and I didn't understand where it all came from. Soon after, probably within a year after we arrived in East Chicago, we moved to Gary, Indiana, and though that wasn't any better in some ways in terms of smell, it was better because we were in our own little house, and we had a yard. And my brother and I really, really found that to be fabulous. It had trees, we could put a swing up, it had a lot of things that we thought were great. We thought we had arrived. So Gary was an interesting place. I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of my education there. But I just wanted to mention about us being farm workers. And we actually had to keep doing that because my father didn't always have work in the steel mills. Sometimes there was no work and they had to cut back, or there were very long strikes. And so we reverted back to doing what we knew how to do because my parents refused to take any kind of public assistance. And so we went to work and we would travel. And that's where I got to see Michigan. We picked cherries up in Michigan. We picked tomatoes in Illinois. And so Michigan was a beautiful place. We loved coming up here because it was great. And we enjoyed the cherries too. It was great. One of the things that I talk to students about a lot is that work as a farm worker, as a migrant worker, and what that taught us. Because when I was young, during that time, I could see other kids playing. I could see other kids going to camps and having fun, and we had to go and work on farms and stay in places that were not really in conditions for humans. But nevertheless, again, we had to make a living. We had that little house that my parents refused to lose, and we had to make sure that we had some money to pay for that, and that's where most of our money went to, other than rice and beans and tortillas, which is what we ate a lot of, which is great and one of my favorite foods today. So the roles that we played as migrants in a family were quite important, and it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot for later in life, and it taught me teamwork. It taught me responsibility and accountability, because we all had to work together. It was a process. It was a process to get going in the morning, especially with my younger brother, and all the things that had to get done with him in order to get him there with us. And food, and packing food, and all of that, washing, and we stayed in places where they didn't have running water, so we had to go get water. There were no toilets, so we had to make sure that we knew where the outhouse was. And so it was quite the learning experience in terms of family dynamics and making sure that everything fit and that we were ready to work and ready to go to work. And my father made sure we planned the day in terms of how many crates we were going to fill and what our goal was. So I learned a lot about goal setting. And it was great because it always felt good. At the end of the day, when we accomplished our goal, I got to feel that great accomplishment and that internal satisfaction that you get when you reach a goal, and that we did it together. And so there was a lot of good synergy among the family, and making sure that we were always celebrating together too. And we worked a lot, and it was a great experience. So let me talk a little bit about then what happened in that early time and education. So I started school, or I went to school there probably from about 3rd grade through 12th grade. In elementary school, we had to walk quite a ways to get to our schools. But in middle school and in high school, we were bused. We were bused from what you would call the ghetto area, the barrio. It was a very mixed community in Gary. It was right at the edge of Gary. And it was very diverse, as I said. We had Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, all kinds of Latinos. We had African Americans, and we had Appalachian whites. And so we all got along. We lived well together. We didn't have any problems. It was a really great community in that area. And but we were bused. We didn't have a middle or high school in that area. So we were bused to an upper middle class, middle school and high school. The middle school wasn't so bad. The high school was quite treacherous. There were race riots. We had to close the school just because of that until things settled down. And then they'd let us back in. And again, there was a lot of careful supervision of the student body because of those things, but it was a very tough time. Integration was good. I mean, we got to be with other students who were not like us, didn't come from our backgrounds, and that was a good exposure. On the other hand, it was bad because it wasn't necessarily a welcoming community. And so we had to learn to get along, we had to learn to accept, and we had to learn to be willing to be educated there. And so that was a good experience, but it taught me too, when I was in the high school there, to be a mediator. I had a lot of friends from both communities, and I was able to negotiate some things among people. I did learn a lot of leadership skills there. I was fortunate that I was bold and took on the challenge of running for class office. I did it my sophomore year to be junior class president, and I didn't realize how hard that would be, even though I had a lot of friends in that community where the school was. It was still a challenge when it came to being accepted. And I remember in the hallway one day that a very prominent student from that community where the school was said very loudly for me to hear around many students that there would never be a Mexican president of our class. And he didn't use the word Mexican. He used a derogatory term for Mexican. And so I knew that it was going to be an uphill battle in that campaign. And nevertheless, I did win. And I not only was president of the junior class, but then became president of our senior class. So I think you can break ceilings. I think you can be bold and take challenges on no matter where you come from and not be afraid. And so, and though some people try to push you down sometimes for whatever reason, you need to be standing up and always moving forward. And so that was a great lesson for me because it did teach me to be courageous. It taught me to not be afraid to take on even when people don't think that you should be there. So let me move forward. I was going to graduate and it was towards the end of my senior year, and my senior counselor said, "Where are you going to college?" And we had a different counselor in every grade, so she really didn't, I didn't really know her. She was a senior counselor. So she said to me one day, "Where are you going to college?" And I said, "College? What do you mean college? I never thought about college. Nobody's ever talked to me about college. I'm not ready for college. I'm not in the, we were tracked in those days. Vocational, general, and college bound. And I was in the general track. And so she said, "You've got to go to college." And I said, "I can't go to college. My parents don't have any money. I'm not ready. I'm not going to college." So she kept on me, and she did convince me to apply. And my brother, my older brother that I have mentioned, was a track star in Indiana. And he was recruited by many schools. And though he too was in a general track, he was an athlete. And he was offered a lot of scholarships. And so he picked Aquinas out of hundreds of schools that recruited him. And so he went to Aquinas. So a year later, when I was kind of dealing with this, I said to the counselor, "Why not Aquinas? Al's there, maybe I'll try that." It's pretty safe. And we did, and I was accepted. I was accepted provisionally because I didn't have some of the courses that they required, but they were going to give me a chance. And so I went to Aquinas. I got accepted. I went there, and I did well. I did very well. I was very pleased about that. I had to catch up, though. I had to take extra courses in English and in math, and I had to learn to kind of navigate my way, but to make sure that I was meeting the expectations of the school and that I could stay in. But that too was a culture shock, because from there I went to a private Catholic school from Gary, from the school I was at, and even though we had we mingled with students who were in middle and upper middle class. At Aquinas, there were students there from Grosse Pointe and some pretty prominent areas, not just from Michigan, but from around the country. And so, so that was a culture shock too. I didn't realize how varied cultures were. And including African Americans. I was used to African Americans like me in kind of how I grew up and in my kind of neighborhood. And there were some African Americans, a few, but they were, I went to someone's home during a break that we had, and I was invited by the student to come to his house. And I went to his house, and I was shocked. They were upper middle class, maybe higher, And it was just wonderful to see and wonderful to feel, because I had never seen that. I had never experienced it. And it was great to see that there were people like me, and though I'm not African American, but like me in many ways, that had progressed in life and had gotten to that point. And so I learned a lot during that time. And so Aquinas was an incredible experience. I graduated in 4 years. I got a teaching degree also during that time, which is hard to do for students in education these days, to be finished in 4 years. But the greatest thing there that happened is I met Mary. Mary and I met at Aquinas, and we got married right after I graduated. She was a year behind me, but as soon as I graduated, 2 weeks later, my parents could have killed me, we got married. And we decided to make Grand Rapids our home. She was from the Chicago area. And so that was a great thing that happened to me. We've been married for 48 years, and as Kaylor mentioned, we have 2 sons and now 2 grandchildren. So that's been great. So after Aquinas, I went to work. I'll talk about my career in a minute, but a couple years into my job, I decided I wanted to do something more. I went to graduate school, and I wanted to do something more with what I was doing. I was a teacher, but I wanted to get more involved with families and children. So I went to Wayne State University. I got into a very special program during those days. It was funded through the federal government. They wanted more clinical psychologists in the urban school districts. And so I thought that would be great. I'd love to do that. And so I did it. It was a 3-year program. I got in late, so I did it in 2 years. I had to do it in 2 years. I did have a bleeding ulcer and an emergency at one time, but I did make it through, and I loved the program. So I was trained as a clinical psychologist, as a master's degree, but also earned a certificate to be a school psychologist. So I had taken a leave from Grand Rapids, and I came back to Grand Rapids. They hired me back as a school psychologist. Talk about that in a minute. But graduate school was different. I was married. I had to work for my grant from the federal government. I had to work in the Detroit Public Schools, and that was quite an experience as an intern, but really nobody there to help me. So I was the only psychologist in the buildings I served as an intern with no psychologist supervision except for the university. So I learned a lot very quickly, and there's nothing better than diving in and learning as much as you can while you're in the hot seat. After that, years later, I decided I wanted a PhD, and so I went to Michigan State University. I got into a program, a school that is no longer there. It's now part of the School of Education, but at that time it was called Human Ecology, and it was a great program. I got to design my own program, my own curriculum, and I did a combination, a multidisciplinary program for that PhD. And I did it in family and child ecology. So I pulled together psychology, sociology, anthropology, and economics. And so that was my PhD program. It took me 7 years, but I was working full time and had a family. By then we had 2 young boys, and we were pretty active. But 7 years was the limit, and I got in just under the wire, so I finished. So what did I learn from all of that education? I learned a lot of strategic planning, because when you're in school and you're in a university, you better learn strategic planning, because it takes a lot of planning to get through the maze of all the requirements and all the things you have to do. I also believed in lifelong learning, that we should never stop learning. I thought my bachelor's would be it, and then I got my master's, and I said, no, there's got to be more. And so even after a terminal degree, there's got to be more. So keep learning, always keep learning. Never give up. There were times, and I know there are times, when students want to drop out and don't. because it's perseverance, and it also prepares you for the future, because you'll have these challenges all through your life. And so I learned a lot during that time of my schooling, and from every place that I went, I learned to be passionate about learning, and that learning is relevant to you, and make it relevant to you, and make sure that you are taking everything in that you can. And it's important to have dreams. I did dream of working with families and children. I had dreams of working at a university. I had those kind of dreams. And so, you know, when they say, have a dream and go for it, believe it, because it's really true. It kind of motivates you all the way through. Let me quickly go through my career path, and then I'll tell you what I learned from that. So I was a teacher right out of Aquinas. I taught first grade. I taught 2 years, and believe it or not, I saw so many problems with those first graders, and that's why I wanted to go and do something more. I wanted to do something more with families and children. I saw incredible situations that I couldn't believe, and in some of these situations, nobody spoke the child's language. That school that I went to work for in Grand Rapids was the first bilingual program in Grand Rapids. And we got a Title VII grant, and we created a bilingual program. And in those days, I created my own tape. There were hardly any Spanish materials. I had to create tapes for kids to listen to, and I had to write my own books for the kids. So luckily, it was first grade, so I could do that. And so it was a lot of work, but it was really important for these kids and these families to have somebody that spoke their language. I was only one of 2 Spanish-speaking teachers in those days, and it was rewarding, but at the same time kind of challenging. I became a school psychologist. I came back to Grand Rapids. They hired me back as a psychologist. I had 10 schools. It was crazy. You can imagine schools that are all in the inner city, and the kind of referrals. Everybody wants to put these kids who don't fit in somewhere else, so they refer them for a psychological, and then it's up to us to diagnose. Some kids did have learning disabilities, some kids did have learning delays, some kids did have emotional problems, but it was pretty rare. Most of these kids just didn't fit in the environment we created for them. And so I got in trouble a couple times with the teachers' unions because of the recommendations that I would make, but I always wanted to make sure that I was an advocate for the kids. And the parents in those areas, because a lot of times we expect learners to fit our style when we're the teacher or we're the principal or the superintendent. We expect kids to be right exactly the way we say. And that's just not the case. And so a lot of times we have to learn to be a little flexible and create environments where children are welcomed and feel comfortable with their learning style. And so I had a lot of great fun with that. I really enjoyed it. I later became an administrator. Somebody thought I ought to be an administrator, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to keep working with families and children. However, I did succumb and became an administrator. There were very few minorities in the Grand Rapids Public Schools, and during affirmative action, somebody thought that I had some skills in that area and felt that I should be in the administration. So again, I said okay, and I got a job as a supervisor in special education, eventually becoming director of special education for Grand Rapids. And then later, when I finished my PhD, the superintendent asked me to be head of the testing and evaluation department for the district. And so I did that, and that was a K-12 operation, and we tested the students the MEP tests, all the things that you do with assessments. We even created during that time I was there high school competency tests, which we don't have anymore. But we created 7 tests that students had to pass, or else they wouldn't get a Grand Rapids Public School diploma. And unfortunately, after I left, it was very successful, and we never got sued because it was a very high-stakes test, obviously. If a student doesn't get a diploma after 12 years, what do you mean? And if they didn't have the schools, we didn't give them a diploma. And we had a lot of controversy in the community about it. I was in the media a lot. But we made it through, and again, never got sued. But several years after I left that position, the district, I had left Grand Rapids Public Schools, and the district let it go because of budgetary problems. And so that was the end of that. I left Grand Rapids Public Schools from that job to be a dean of GRCC. GRCC was GRJC, Junior College. Some of you may remember, some of you in the audience. And in 1991, it separated from the public schools and became its own entity, thanks to the voters of Kent County, and it became Community College, Grand Rapids Community College. So the president of the college at that time asked me to come over, since my department did evaluations of all the technical programs of the junior college. We were familiar with them. He asked me to come with the new developed college. And so there was going to be a new superintendent in the district, and I thought this would be a good time for me to move on. So I did. I went to the community college. I served there as Dean of Institutional Research, IT, and Enrollment Management for 8 years. And then I was encouraged to throw my hat in for the presidency when the president retired, and I did that. And very surprisingly, I got the job. And so I became president of GRCC, and that was a great experience. And my first CEO job, which was, I learned a lot, and I did that for 10 years. And we did a lot of good things during those years, and certainly I learned an awful lot, especially around managing large groups of people. And one of the proudest things I have about the time I was there is we went into the continuous quality improvement initiative that many companies, businesses were getting into, and we decided we were going to do that. And before I left that job in 2008, we won the Michigan Quality Award, and we were the first higher education institution in the state that ever won a quality award. So we were very proud of that. And it took the faculty and it took all the staff a lot of work over many years, probably 6 years, to get us there. So that was a great accomplishment. And then I had the great fortune of going to a place that I knew nothing about. I took a huge risk. I didn't even know much of the work that I would be doing. But I was recruited by a search firm out of Chicago for a position that was open with the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. And I wasn't interested at first. I said, no, I don't have any time for this. And he kept at me. He was vigilant. And I finally said, okay, tell me more about it and let me learn about it. And so he did, and then I got interested. I thought, well, I've been at the community college for 18 years. It's probably time, and maybe something is calling me to do something different. And so I decided to apply, and I got the job. And so I went to the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, and I see some people here from there. Can't believe you drove here for this. But thank you. So I went to the Kalamazoo Community Foundation and had a great experience there. Learned a lot about the community that I knew nothing about. And it was a challenge. And students, I want you to hear this, because taking risks, it doesn't feel good sometimes. But to put yourself out there is really good for you. It really stretches you. It keeps you thinking. It keeps your mind fresh, because I had to learn new skills. I had to learn a community where I knew no one. I knew no one at the Community Foundation, but I knew no one in the community. And I had to start somewhat from scratch. Nobody knew me. It was like, hi, it's me, President. I mean, nobody knew me. And it was, and I can't say that they didn't care, because people would wave at me on the street. It was a very welcoming community, because they had seen my picture in the paper. And they knew I had come to Kalamazoo, and so it was a very friendly town. I was well accepted, but I felt very strange and out of my comfort zone, and it taught me to get with the rhythm, learn, try new things, and I had a fabulous staff. I had fabulous people that I worked with. And unfortunately, 3 years later, Aquinas needed a president. They were looking. They had asked me to consider it while I was president of GRCC. It never seemed to be a good time, so I never went there. And they some board members tapped me and encouraged me. And so Mary and I talked about it. We thought, maybe this is a calling, and we need to give back to the place that helped us when we were young. And so I had to tell my staff and my board that I had considered this and that I had gotten the job at Aquinas. And so I left and came back to Grand Rapids and became president of Aquinas College. And I was there as president for 6 years. And as Kaylor referenced, I retired in the middle of 2017. And then I came here to Grand Valley, which is great. And so somebody recently told me that I'm going to run out of colleges and universities pretty soon. So anyways, I came here, and I've learned a lot of things in terms of my career path. Probably the greatest thing is that education, experience, and knowing how to work with people is the ticket to progress and the ticket out of poverty, if you're in poverty. Education, and then, of course, good experiences give you the opportunity, give you the access to many things that we need. And I never really realized that. My parents would tell me, but, you don't always believe your parents. And so I had to live it myself. And so I say to you, students, understand that this education that you're getting is very, very important. And the experiences that you're getting, don't take them lightly. Don't take them lightly. And look for experiences so that you can suck up everything you can in skills and competencies and know-how so that you can be successful. So in closing, because I want to leave some time for some questions, I just leave you students with 3 things. What does all this have to do with leadership, and kind of how can you wrap this up? How can I wrap this up for you? I want to leave you with 3 things that I think have been important for me in a leadership way. And the first is know yourself. Know who you are. Spend time on that. Don't take that lightly. Value where you come from and be proud of where you come from. And you might be different from other people. Not just the color of your skin or the language that you speak or what nation you come from. You may be different, but you may be different in thought too. There's a lot of diversity in thought and experiences and life experiences. So know who you are. You will be motivated by that, and it's very important for you to understand that if you can accept yourself and you truly accept who you are and you know who you are because you've thought about it deeply, then you can accept others. Because none of us are perfect. There is no right person. There isn't anything like that. We're all different, we're made different, and we all bring gifts to the table. And so know that you have gifts that you bring. You know that you have strengths that you have. Work on them. And most importantly, know what your weaknesses are, because that will help you strengthen yourself. And don't be afraid of knowing what your weaknesses are And one of the greatest things that ever happened to me is when I wanted to be the president of GRCC, I went through a lot of work to know who I was by that point and what I had learned. And I went to a coach who offered to coach me. I didn't know him. We had a mutual friend. He offered. I said, okay. And he taught me things that really hurt. I had to learn what I wasn't good at. He didn't care about what I could do and what I was good at. He wanted to know what my weaknesses were. And he challenged me and he pushed me. And he really made me realize that by understanding and facing my weaknesses, I could be stronger and I could overcome those. And so by the time I got to the interview process and all the forums I had to do with the public, I felt very ready to do that because of what he taught me. Secondly, develop courage. To be a leader, you have to have courage. It's really important to understand that and to know how to develop that. Courage doesn't mean that you're a bully. Courage means that you can make hard decisions. It means that you can be bold when you need to be bold and that you can stand behind your decisions. It also means that you can accept failure. When you're courageous, you can face failure and you can admit failure. I remember one time I stood in front of 1,000 faculty and staff at the GRCC field house, and I told them an error that we had made and that I took full responsibility for it. And that is courage, because a lot of times leaders try to hide mistakes, try to hide the things that don't go well. You've got to be out front, and you've got to be able to be vulnerable. That's developing courage. And don't be afraid of it. I encourage you to look deeply into that. And the third thing I leave you with is build community. Everything is about community. Even family is community. Think interdependence when you think about community, because we are dependent on each other. You can't do anything alone. Well, maybe a paper that you have to write for your class, but even now we do a lot of teamwork on those things. Perhaps an SAT test you have to do alone, but most things we do, we must do together. And we are interdependent as a society, as a people, and we have to always work at trying to build community, and especially if you're the leader, or if you're part of a leadership group, building community is got to be everywhere, not just out in the big community, but in your department, in your area of work, in your corporation, wherever you go. Develop teamwork. Work as a team player. Understand what it means to be a follower, not just a leader. Being a follower is very important, and there's as much technique in being a follower as there is in being a leader. So be a follower too, so that you don't always have to be the one with the right answer or the answer, that there are many answers, and listen to people. And that creates community, accepting people for who they are, what they bring to the table. You don't always have to be the one that has the last voice, whether you're one of the team members, whether you're the team leader. You don't have to be the one with the final. It can be others, and it should be others, because you want to encourage others to be open and to bring their true self to the table. And so that's really what it takes. And to build community, we are in need of community right now. We're in need all over to form community and to trust each other and building trust. We see it everywhere. We have to work at it. It's got to be deliberate. And those of you, students, who want to be leaders, and you're leaders in your own right now, but you have got to really, really understand that ability and what it takes to create a good community, no matter what that means in the situation you're in. So I leave you with those, and I hope there will be some questions based on my journey, no matter where you want to take me, or anything about leadership. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you, Dr. Olivares, for your talk and your wisdom. Going back to the beginning when you're taking over the care of your younger brother, how did you navigate that family conflict? It seems like you grew up in a pretty peaceable household, and making that decision that your parents weren't capable and it wasn't healthy for them to still being taking care of your younger brother. How did you navigate that?
Well, mostly because I felt that it was good for my brother to leave my parents. And it was interesting, and it did take my mom 10 years to come to that decision herself, that she really couldn't do it anymore. And it started slowly through the years. At first she would get mad at me for bringing the subject up. How dare me think of her giving up this child that God had given her, and that she was responsible for him, she and my father. And then it would be kind of just listening without getting angry, and then it would be asking questions, and then it would be, okay, take me on a visit, okay, and then it would be, no, that's not it, no, that's not it, no, that's not it. It was a lot of that, and then finally she found the place. She accepted a place. It was what my brother needed, and you know, when he left home, he blossomed. He was living with two old people, and his mental age was probably a 3-year-old level, his mental age, cognitive age. Couldn't make a lot of decisions for himself. He couldn't toilet himself. He couldn't take a bath by himself because regulating water, you know, he couldn't do that. So he needed a lot of care. But nevertheless, he had a lot of intellect. And if you've ever worked with people with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, there's a lot there. You just have to bring it out. And so the place where he went, they knew how to work with people like him. And they brought a lot of really great stuff out of him, and great talents, and he was helping them prepare food and going to the mailbox and all kinds of things. Worked in a sheltered workshop, and so it was good for him, and my mom finally saw that it was good for him. In fact, she was hurt because, and we had to get a psychologist involved, because after we placed him, and he would come home, and then he'd go back, but after about 2 times, I think he thought it might end, and so he didn't want to come home. He fought them bringing him home, and he didn't want to come in the house when they got him there. And so my mom was really hurt. But the point, his point was, he was afraid that he wouldn't go back, because that became his home. And so he wanted to be there. He really wanted his independence. And I always knew that. I was very close to him. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for your story. Lots of lessons to learn. My question is in regards to inclusion. So you had talked about advocating for students that were put in situations with built environment. What other ways can we advocate for populations, individuals who are forced to fit into societies or systems that are built for them?
Great question. Great question. And I'll answer it this way. I think it used to be, there was a time when we were expected to fit in regardless. And we would, we heard a lot about mainstream. You gotta be in the mainstream. You gotta be in the mainstream. You've got to fit into the mainstream. If you want to make it in life, you've got to be in the mainstream. You've got to be acculturated. And times have changed. Times have changed. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think it's still there. I think there's still a lot of bias, and I think there's a lot of trying to make people fit. But I think, and I said this recently to a group of Latinx community members we were meeting. And we were talking about the number of Latinx professionals in the community now, here in this community. And I'm usually now the oldest in the room, so I could talk about the past when there were only a few of us. in the community that had a Hispanic background. And it was difficult. It was very difficult to be heard, to be included. Though I served on a lot of boards and have served on a lot of boards in the community, a lot of times I felt like a token because I was the only one that could. It was difficult. So today we have more to choose from. I mean, boards can even have more than one. They can have multiple types. and it's encouraging and it's good because it changes perspective and it changes a lot of things. And so I think lots of boards, and the Johnson Center is involved with an initiative right now called the Ecosystem Initiative, where we're hoping to train more persons of color to be on boards and to have that skill and that ability, so that boards who are looking for diversity on their boards have people to choose from, and that they're not going to come and fail, that they're going to come and be successful. And so the same is true of organizations. Again, I was the first this, and I was the first that, and that's nice. I'm very humbled by that, but I don't want to be the first anymore. I want many others to be the first, and we've got to get more people out there accepting that inclusion is important and that diversity is critically important. I just interviewed Jim Hackett, CEO of Ford Motor Company, who was here at Steelcase. I interviewed him for a video that Kayla and I just produced for a program that we did. And I had him talk about diversity and inclusion. And we only used a little bit of a soundbite because he had a lot to say about diversity and inclusion, because he's a big supporter and a big advocate and a leader in that area. But we used a small clip, and it was really meant to be for a business community so that they would listen, and so that the business community can keep listening to people like him to say, no, it is a business imperative that we do this. It is a societal imperative. Right now, Kayla and I are studying inclusive growth. That's really our deep dive that we're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're studying how do you get a community to be an inclusive community, an inclusive economy, so that more people have prosperity in our community. We should want everyone to have prosperity in our community because we all benefit when that happens. And so in our work, we're studying what it takes to be an inclusive community. And for us, the way we're studying it is that an inclusive community is an outcome. It's not a process, it's not a program, it's not anything like that. It's kind of a place you want to be, so that there is access and opportunity for everyone. And we know everyone won't get there, but we have to aspire to that. There has to be more access and opportunity for more people in services, especially around education, and building our human capital that we have. A lot of it is going to waste, and we just can't afford that. So to your question, the techniques are multiple, and we're trying to study what those are and how do we get people to accept that. I did a presentation yesterday about this, and it was somebody asked a question about being, how do we not be altruistic when we try to be inclusive and want everybody to do well? Well, if everybody does well, that means I'm not going to do as well. Well, that's not it. That's not the way we should think. Everybody does well, we all do well. And there's plenty to go around. There's plenty of money to go around, and we shouldn't have the divide that we have today. And so by doing that, we want people to understand what it means to be accepting of others. And the video that we produced shows that by 2044, the majority of the people in this country will be people of color. And so let's not be afraid of it. Let's embrace it. But if the educational attainment of Hispanics and African Americans and other persons of color are down here, which they are, think of the dilemma we have of our workforce in the future. We have got to change this trajectory. And so we have got to understand that we have to do something to make sure we're including more and more people in access to education, but access to jobs and access to a livable wage. And so it's everybody's business when we talk about becoming an inclusive growth community. And so I could go on and on with that question, but it's a very important one, so thank you. And there's many tools and people that can help you if you're interested out there. Yes, Ron?
Let the audience know that Juan and I know each other for a very long time and have a lot of respect for him.
Thank you.
And we have similar backgrounds.
Except you were a manufacturer. Yeah, engineer, right?
Education.
Yeah.
Grew up in poverty, single mom, Detroit.
That's right.
So went through a lot of things. One of the observations I want to make is that you grew up in a culture that was pretty much not inclusive. It was pretty well contained. I did likewise, growing up in a city called Amsterdam. Eastern Europeans
Oh, yeah.
were all
Right.
there.
Yeah.
And as you grow older, you learn about how to include more people. Like when I went to engineering school a long time ago, almost 100% of our engineers were males. Okay. Today it's 35% females and minorities. That took a long time to
Right.
evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about getting people included, we also have to create opportunities for them to have careers and jobs that they can sustain themselves. What's your observation on how we can do a better job of that, to encourage more younger people to look at those other careers that they might not have historically looked at because A, their parents haven't been in it,
Right.
and B, their friends don't go in it and stuff like
Right,
that. Do you have any observations on that?
Well, exposure in our schools. I mean, there are programs like JA. I mean, there's so many programs where students can be given exposure, access to information, access in terms of what's out there. I didn't say much about this, but I have to. I regret not using it in earlier, but mentors and coaches and people around you who show you things that are possible. I had that fortune of having that along the way. I've had many people that I've looked up to. I've had people who said, Juan, you ought to try. I mean, going for the GRCC job, I was a dean. What do you mean you think I could be president? And so people who encourage young people to get information, to learn about things, and to get that exposure. There are so many things out there. The community college is a great place to start for many students because they get exposed to many opportunities and career paths. And the schools, KISD has programs, our intermediate districts have programs, our schools have programs, but make sure that parents are also learning, because sometimes parents can discourage their child. They're afraid for them to fail, they're afraid for them for whatever reason. So parents need that education too, and we have to do more and more of that. But I think exposure, access, and opportunity, I keep saying that. We talk a lot about this. The way out of all of this is access and opportunity. How many gates do we have around everything we do? How many, let's open them up. Let's let people in. Let's shadowing programs, internships, all those kinds of things. Kaler is a great example. Kaler looks for opportunities. I just heard he's probably going to do an internship in Ottawa County. And he's always looking for opportunities to learn something new or to go and take advantage of something. That's how you have to be, and we have to encourage young people to do that. And we have to start early. We have got to start early. Second grade is not too early. Kindergarten's not too early to expose kids to things like making things that lead up to engineering or in math or in fun things that we can do with kids to get them interested in other careers. So, I know we probably are done. Gleaves. Hi, Gleaves. You cut me off, right?
No, not at all. Thank you so much for a very enlightening and poignant conversation with us. And I have a question about Michigan. Since you've spent your life in education, I think it's just staggeringly unacceptable that we're 50th in the nation for third graders reading. Why is that the case in Michigan with all of the bright people of goodwill who are, because if you can't read, you can't start on that escalator up.
Yeah.
What are your observations about that? Thank you.
You bet. I'll try not to make this long because there's food out there. That is appalling. I'll start there. It's appalling that that we're in that rank, and that third grade reading is a measure that's so important. And we know from the research, if you're not at third grade by third grade reading level by third grade, chances are you're going to be behind, because remediation through research proves it doesn't work overall. It helps some, but not the vast majority. So we waste a lot of resources on that. So the effort should be on early education. So I'm really proud, I hope you're proud of Kent County, who passed last November a millage for early childhood. And I see Julie Reidenauer here, who's on the commission with me. That millage was so important, and it took a long time to get there. But the voters accepted to put money in for 0 to 3 especially. But it's all about preparing children for kindergarten. And people think it's a joke, and people think, the general public who don't know, that they think that's just kid stuff, baby stuff. What do you mean? Just play with them. Well, that's true. We can play with them, and play is important. I used to teach a class on play, but you have to do the right play, and you have to have people trained to do that, and parents to know how play can lead to language skills and math skills and exposure to vocabulary. All of that matters when we measure third grade reading. So we have an issue. We have an issue, and I wish I had an answer for you, Gleaves, because we have to create an answer. And it's one of the things I talk about. And when Kayla and I did our presentation Monday to the Council of Michigan Foundations, we talked about measures, and one of them is third grade reading, because we're talking about human capital that we have to develop in our communities. But let me tell you one thing that scared me big time. I had the great fortune of being asked to interview for a position in Washington, and it was Assistant Secretary of Education. And I interviewed with the White House staff, and I then had the privilege of interviewing, after I passed that, I got the privilege of interviewing with the Secretary of Education at the time, which was Margaret Spelling. And I went in, and it's just her and her chief of staff, and I sat down, and she said, "Juan, what are we going to do?" That scared me. This is the Secretary of Education asking me, what are we going to do? But that's where we are. We're searching for answers, and there are nuggets of answers everywhere. We have to have the will and the courage, by the way, to bring it together. And if I can say, politics divide that a great deal in our country, because we go here during one administration, and then we go here for another administration, because everybody wants to be known for their piece, and they name it something different, and then the focus is on something else. It's just one of the issues, but that political scene is an important one. And if there are any politicians in this room, I'd be happy to talk about it. I'm not shy about it because it makes me very angry. I watched Washington. Sitting on the National Institute for Literacy for 6 years, I learned Washington. And that's why I think I was asked to interview for this assistant secretary job. And it's appalling what I saw in terms of, and I saw a change in administration, so I saw it firsthand. We did nothing for 2 years, 2 years, where we were trying to make an impact on early learning. And we were here, and then we had to drop everything and start all over again with something else. And by the way, then we all got ousted because now there's a new president, and they get to appoint the members on the board. And so it just, you know, it's just crazy sometimes. But I do think the elements that I would like to leave the students with is wherever you are, know that we have to start early in building human capital, because human capital is our biggest asset that we have in our communities. And human capital doesn't get to where we need it to be without starting early. And we've got to progress all the way through. And third grade reading is a great place for us to measure whether or not students are achieving. And we've got to get parents involved. The Harlem Children's Zone that some of us studied in Kalamazoo and went to New York and saw what they were doing. You know, even having a baby college where parents come and they get taught how to be a parent so that their child is ready to learn. Parents don't know. None of us got a handbook when we had a child. And so some of us, it was intuitive. Some of us had good parenting. Some of us can read and we can look up things. Some parents can't. And so we've got to get them there and help them there. So it's a very deep question, Gleaves, and it's an issue that every citizen in our communities, in our state, nationally, have got to pay attention to, because we are dropping back, and this is, for me, a national security issue. And we are not focusing on the right things right now. And you can quote me on that. So, thank you.